Hello everybody and welcome back to Sam and Ham. This is Ham and today we're going to be doing a little bit of review on Kibble's generic spells. So if you're new to the Homebrew community or just haven't heard of him, Kibblestasty is a pretty big name in the community. He has done some of the most well-known classes, subclasses, just general homebrew. He's known for his quality. Gotta say, I haven't done a review on it yet, but his Warlord class, one of my favorite homebrews I've ever seen. Quite honestly, I look forward to the day where I play a campaign where I can play it. Sounds super cool. Anyway, not to gush. He, about a couple of weeks ago, came out with a little packet of what he calls generic spells. These spells aren't going to be groundbreaking. As he even says, they're just here because wizards forgot to make non-fire spells. Which is true. I mean, have you ever tried to make a wizard or a sorcerer that doesn't cast any fire spells?
I have. It sucks.
Yeah, that's true. Basically, when Sam tried to make a sorcerer who used primarily ice and water magic,
To be honest, she was inspired off of Elsa because Frozen had just come out at the time.
Well, you know how it be. So, basically what I let her do is just reflavor a lot of fire spells as ice. It's very easy to take burning hands and make it into icy hands. So, it's very easy to do stuff like that. And I haven't read 100% of this yet. I've glanced through enough of it to get a feel for it. And I like it so far, but let's read through it together and just kind of see what we got. So, right through these couple of pages, I really actually recommend reading through here because he does a really good write-up on what the general elements are supposed to do. I don't want to go through it all right now here with you guys, but again, so like he says here, cold deals less damage than the other types and often uses d8s. Tends to debuff the target, slowing them, restraining them, or leaving them difficult terrain. Often feature constitution saves. Those small things are what really help keep the spells feeling separate. Yeah, you can reflavor Burning Hands to Icy Hands, but it's not going to feel like an ice spell if it doesn't slow the enemy, or, like it mentions, using d8s. If it did 2d8 damage rather than 3d6, 2d8, is it worse than 3d6? Yes. Not arguing, just mathematically it's not as good. However, 2d8 plus reducing somebody's speed by 10 feet, it goes miles to make it feel much more like an ice spell rather than just a reflavored fire spell. So, that's what he talks about throughout these first couple of pages, and I really like it. It's an interesting read if you guys got the time. So, first one up, Crashing Wave. First level conjuration spell for druids, sorcerers, and wizards. Takes an action, range of self, 15-foot cone, instant speed. Each creature in a 15-foot cone in front of you must make a strength saving throw. On a failed save, creature takes 2d6 bludgeoning damage and is knocked 10 feet back from you. If a creature is knocked into a wall or another creature, or fails by 5 or more, it is additionally knocked prone. On a successful save, they take half damage and aren't knocked back. And when you upcast, it does an extra d6. This is what I'm talking about. This is basically reskin Burning Hands. But it feels different, and anybody who tries to make a water mage is gonna really want to go for this one. Yes, it does less damage, but that knockback, super cool, super flavorful. And I really wish that a lot more, like, default spells would use this whole if you fail by a 5 or more thing. I believe, haven't done a ton of reading into it, but I believe Pathfinder 2nd Edition actually does a lot of that. An example of that fail by 5 or more is actually looking at the Drow Elite Warrior creature stat block. They have a DC 13 Constitution save poison. If they fail by 5 or more, they're unconscious. If they, just fail by less than 5, they just take the damage. So there is precedent for that in 5th edition, and I think it could be really cool if they did a lot more. So I'm not going to get into a 1 to 10 scaling on a lot of these, just because it'd take too long to really go through all the scaling, and I don't want to try to rank these above each other. But basically, I'm just going to give it a little pass-fail, and this one, easy pass. Next up is Dancing Wave. It's a 2nd level conjuration spell for druid, sorcerer, and wizard, and the occultist again. It's an action to cast, has a range of 30 feet, has a concentration for up to a minute. You summon a surging mass of water into existence at a point within range. The mass of water remains cohesive, filling a 5-foot radius, though it only raises about 3 feet from the ground. The area is difficult terrain for any creature without a swimming speed. I like to imagine a Triton player just kind of treading water there. For the duration of the spell, as a bonus action, you can move the water up to 30 feet along a surface in any direction. The first time the water enters a creature's space during your turn, they must make a strength saving throw or take a d6 of bludgeoning damage and be knocked prone. A creature automatically fails a saving throw against this spell if they are prone. Kind of same thing as above. I think this is a great spell. Obviously, you compare it to Flaming Sphere. They're very similar spells. The biggest difference, obviously, being that this one gives a strength saving throw rather than dexterity, which is actually pretty cool. There's not enough spells that target strength saving throws. Definitely a good one to counter if you're the DM and you have a rogue player who's been using their evasion to dodge all your spells, then this is a good way to get around that. Obviously it does less damage than Flaming Sphere, but it does knock them prone, which is cool. Next spell, Geyser. Druid, Sorcerer, Wizard. Classic combo. Action, it's got 120-foot range, instant speed. You cause a massive eruption of water to blast upwards from a point within range. A creature within 10 feet of the point must make a dex saving throw or take 4d6 bludgeoning damage and be knocked 60 feet into the air. On a successful save, creatures take half as much damage and are knocked their choice of 10 feet away or 10 feet upward. So I think this spell is pretty neat. So I think a pretty classic one to compare this to is Blight. Blight does 8d8 on a failed saving throw. Though it is single target, where this one can hit a couple of people if they're really close up together. So 8d8 versus this one doing 4d6 bludgeoning, and then potentially 6d6 fall damage. So that's potentially 10d6 in a small AoE. Another one, good one to compare this one to is Ice Storm, which does 4d6 plus 2d8. The only thing about this one that makes me a little nervous is the fact that spells generally don't take fall damage into account for their balance. But I think that's fine. I think it's cool. I think this one could deal with like a reminder text at the end, basically saying, hey, if they fall, they take this much damage. But otherwise, I think it's cool. Pass from me. Pressure Cutter, 5th level Conjuration for Sorcerers and Wizards. Druids didn't make the cut. It's an action, 60-foot line from self. Duration instantaneous. You will unleash a blast of highly pressurized water in a 60-foot, 15-foot wide line, slashing through everything in its path. Creatures in the line must make a dex saving throw or take 10d6 slashing damage on a success or half as much on a fail. Fantastic spell. So everybody kind of knows the whole bit about Fireball and Lightning Bolt being overpowered. If you haven't heard this, it's basically the spells Fireball and Lightning Bolt are overpowered based on the Wizard of the Coast design frame. Basically, the DMG, as you can see on screen, has this whole cutout for how you're supposed to design your own spells. And Fireball and Lightning Bolt don't follow these at all. And when questioned on it, basically Wizard of the Coast said, these spells are historic, and people love them, so we made them strong so people would take them, is the TLDR of the situation. Seems like a perfectly fine spell to me if you compare it to Lightning Bolt. It's a little bit wider, but otherwise it's just an upscaled Lightning Bolt. If you upcast Lightning Bolt to 5th level, it would do 10d6 damage, so this just has slightly better AoE. Technically, it's not even strictly better, because now you have to kind of worry about people being in the way, so cool. Success from me. Water Blast, 1st level spell. Conjure a ball of water. It's for Druids, Sorcerers, and Wizards. Action, 30-foot range. Conjure a ball, hurl it at somebody, make a ranged spell attack against the target. On a hit, the target takes 3d6 bludgeoning damage, and if it's large or smaller, must make a strength saving throw or be knocked prone. This one's pretty good. Obviously immediately comparable to something like Catapult. Does same amount, well, Catapult does 3d8 damage, this does 3d6. It's the same range. I kind of like this one because you get both an attack roll, and then they have to make a save. If it didn't make the save, then I think it'd be too strong. But as it is, I think this is just fine. Being knocked prone isn't exactly the strongest form of crowd control either, so I'd say this is a good way to balance it. I'd say a success. Water Cannon, 3rd level. Druid, Sorcerer, Wizard. I really like this one. You get a 30-foot line, it's 5 foot wide. Creatures in the line must make a strength saving throw, or take 66 bludgeoning damage and be pushed to an open space at the end of the line away from you. And then, if they would be pushed into a wall, or, you know, nowhere for them to go, They take an additional 2d6 bludgeoning damage and are knocked prone. This one's a little strong, but I think it's pretty fine. Again, comparing it to Lightning Bolt, if they fail their save and if you push them into a wall, which is the optimal situation here, it does the same amount of damage. And it knocks them prone, which again, not the strongest form of crowd control, but it is a form of crowd control. So theoretically, in the optimal situation here, you have something stronger than Lightning Bolt, which is a really strong spell, so this one almost is a little bit pushed. But if you can't push them into anything, then it's okay. It's a little weak. Personally, I think this should probably only do 4 or 5d6 if it doesn't push somebody into a wall, and then do the extra 2d6 if it does. Just because, again, Lightning Bolt is already a decently strong spell, and having an upside on the Lightning Bolt, a little spooky. So this one, it's okay. Could use a little bit of work, I think. Moving on, we're going to be looking at some acid spells. The first one, Erode, for the Occultist or the Wizard. I feel like Sorcerer should probably be able to get it too, but Kibblestasty did say in one of the comments on the Reddit post that you shouldn't pay too much attention to which classes can or can't get it. He basically said if you're already willing to allow Homebrew, you should probably be able to allow Homebrew to what classes get what. So, ignoring that, we got a 3rd level spell here, 20-foot range. It's an action. You blast a target with a massive acid. Target must make a dex saving throw. On a failure, target takes 8d4 acid damage immediately because it's covered in acid. Target takes a target covered in acid takes 2d4 acid damage at the end of each of its turns, and then the creature or a creature within 5 feet of it can use its action to clear away the acid. On a success, the target takes half most damage and is not covered in acid. I think this one's great. Very short range, which is definitely a downside. It's single target. So again, this just seems like pretty bad fireball until you take into account that damage over time from the acid. I've tried to do some damage over time abilities for the Death Knight Homebrew I've done before. It's hard. It's definitely a little bit difficult. I think this one does it pretty well. I mean, anybody can end it as an action. You don't gotta worry about concentration. It's single target, so you don't gotta worry about a whole bunch of different, different creatures having this at once. Unless they cast it multiple times, of course, but also handy if you, have a boss fight and your wizard casts on the boss, you can have the mook cleared off, which is cool. I'd say this one's big success. Huge fan. Acid Rain, 5th level spell, Druid, Wizard, and Occultist. It's an action, 300-foot range, concentration up to a minute. Acid Rain begins to fall in a 40-foot radius, 60-foot high cylinder centered on a point you see within range. When a creature moves into the spell's area for the first time on a turn, or starts its turn there, the creature must succeed on a dex saving throw, or take 8d4 acid damage and become covered in acid. A creature takes 2d4 acid damage if it ends its turn while covered with acid. A creature can clear the acid with an action. Now see, this kind of goes against what I had just said previously, where now you've got to deal with a whole bunch of creatures potentially having AoE. Nobody else, they have to clear it off themselves, which kind of is a little bit of a, odd. I assume if you're playing an acid wizard, you're probably going to have both spells. So it's a little weird that they can clear off the acid from this one, but they can't clear off the acid from this one. I don't think it's huge, but definitely just a little bit odd. If you compare it to Ice Storm actually does more damage with a lower level spell slot if you don't count for the whole damage over time thing. Admittedly, Acid Raid's also a bigger radius, but again, that can also be a bad thing if, you have other people in your party and you're not just playing in, a one-player game at D&D. I'd give Acid Rain a success. I think that's a really well-designed spell. Moving on to Cold next, we're going to start off with Arctic Breath for Druid, Sorcerer, Wizard. Action, self, 30-foot line, instant speed. Shoots out a line in the direction you choose. Each creature in the line must make a dex saving throw. On a fail, it takes 2d8 cold damage, and the movement speed is reduced by 10 feet until the end of their next turn. On a successful save, the creature takes half as much damage and isn't slowed. Love reviewing low-level spells because they're super easy to compare to other things. What you have here is basically just a line spell, which there actually aren't any, really good line spells at first level. So I like this. Makes for a cool thing. And it does a little bit less damage than Burning Hands, but it also has the slow, much like Cold Thing do. Yes, English. Seems like a perfectly great spell. I wish this spell was in the game. Honestly, it's simple and boring and silly, but so far, of all the spells, I think this one's probably my favorite, just because this feels like it could be a real spell. I'm sad that it's not a real spell. Next up's Entomb, a first level transmutation spell. It's only for wizards. Action, 60-foot range, concentration up to a minute. You attempt to encase a medium or smaller creature you can see within the ice. The creature must make a strength saving throw or become restrained by the ice for the duration. At the end of each of its turns, it takes a d8 of cold damage and can make another strength saving throw. On a success, the spell ends for the target. If the creature takes 5 fire or bludgeoning damage from a single damage roll while restrained, the ice breaks and the target is freed, immediately ending the spell. That's cool. I might take it back. Maybe this is my favorite spell. That's super cool. It's very good crowd control at literally level 1. After that, you start to get a little bit iffy. Restrained is better crowd control than prone. It's pretty decent. Not as good as paralyzed or anything, but for a first level spell slot, you can't really complain. But unlike, say, like Hold Person, this one's not going to be good forever, because that 5 damage doesn't scale anywhere. Even if you upcast it, it still says 5 damage to free them. So then you're getting to the point where maybe at higher levels, if you have a player that keeps casting this, maybe, you know, a bad guy has a goblin follow him around with a torch that just breaks him out of the spell. Seems super cool. It also helps, you know, a little with the wizard makes bad guy fail 1 save. Now the fighter just wallops him 100 times for a ton of damage. If the fighter has a bludgeoning weapon, they gotta kind of wait. Like, hey, do I break him out now, or do I try to wait? You never know. Yeah, super cool spell. I think that one's really interesting. I always happy to see some more interesting transmutation spells too. Cold Snap, 2nd level evocation, sorcerer wizard action to cast, 90-foot range, 5-foot radius, and a duration of instantaneous. You basically pick a point in range. Every creature within a 5-foot radius sphere centered on that point makes a constitution saving throw. Creature takes 3d8 cold damage on a failed save, or half as much on a successful one. The ground in the area is covered with slick ice, making it difficult terrain until the start of your next turn. For a 2nd level spell, seems fantastic. It does the same down damage as Agonizer Scorcher, and where it lacks a little bit of the AoE that Agonizers have, it gives you a little bit more mileage with the increased ranged and the difficult terrain. Very cool. Great spell. Flash Freeze, 3rd level evocation, sorcerer wizard. It's a 30-foot cone from the self. Duration instantaneous, action cast. Freezing wind ripples outward. Each creature in a 30-foot cone must make a con saving throw. On a failed save, they take 48 cold damage and is restrained by ice until the start of your next turn. On a successful save, the target takes half as much damage and isn't restrained. This one's actually probably a little too strong, to be honest. Best one to compare it to would be Tidal Wave. Tidal Wave does the same amount of damage, and if they make the failed save, they're just knocked prone. The fact that Flash Freeze here doesn't take concentration to do any kind of crowd control, which is cool, I like it. I just think it probably needs to either do less damage or be at a higher spell slot, to be honest. It's one of those things that doesn't seem too strong on my first read, but once you compare it to the other options that are available, you kind of start to second guess yourself. So this one, yeah, I'd probably say reduce the damage, maybe to 3d8 or 4d6 maybe. It's not a whole lot of damage taken off. That might even still be too strong. There's not a lot of ways at this level that I know of that you can restrain somebody without any kind of concentration. So next up we're going to be looking at Ice Spike. It's a 4th level evocation spell for sorcerers wizards. It's an action to cast, 60-foot range, instantaneous cast, or instantaneous duration. You create lances of ice that shoot up from the ground to impale a creature within range. Target must make a dex saving throw and takes 48 piercing damage and 48 cold damage on failed save. The target only takes 48 cold damage on a successful save. Seems fantastic. Even if actually maybe just a little bit weak. Compare it to Blight. Same amount of damage, different typing obviously, but yeah, seems fine. I'd probably, honestly, I think if I had to make one change to this spell, I'd probably add the whole slowing the enemy by 10 feet or until, you know, the end of the next turn or something. Just to make it feel a little bit more cold. Next up, Fissure. It's a 5th level transmutation spell for druid, sorcerers, and wizards. It's an action to cast, 60-foot line, instant duration. You rend the earth asunder in a 60-foot long line, 5-foot wide, targeting an area of dirt, sand, or rock at least 10 feet deep. Creatures in the line must make a dex save. On a failure, the creature falls into a suddenly opened crevice in the ground, falling into it before it snaps shut, crushing them.
From the fall and crush, creatures that fail the saving throw take 6d10 bludgeoning damage, and the creature is buried in 10 feet of rubble. And creatures without burrowing speed require 30 feet of movement to extract themselves from the loose rubble to return to where they failed the saving throw. If they end their turn while buried, they take an additional d10 of bludgeoning damage. I think the spell is super cool sounding. I love that he puts the, like, ruling here for how do they get out. Because, if he didn't, then, DMs would have questions about how exactly you would logically get out from under 10 feet of rubble. I think the 30 feet of movement is a little brutal, especially if you've got like halflings or dwarves in the party that can't get out in one turn without dashing. But yeah, other than the little bit of brutalness for the short-legged folks in the party, I think the spell's super cool. I do think it does a little bit too much damage. If you look at, 6d10 here versus the other classic 5th level spell, Cone of Cold. 6d10 averages out to like 33. I think 8d8 averages out to like 36. The 3 damage on average definitely doesn't make up for the whole buried thing, even though this one does have a little bit more requirements in the way of casting. This does have quite a few more limiting casting options. I mean, one, you can't point it in the air at anything that's flying above you, and, you gotta be in dirt, sand, or rock. That's a whole bunch of stuff, so I don't think it's too far off from balanced. I mean, Cone of Cold definitely has the flexibility over it on this one, but I still think all the added utility you're getting from this one more than makes up for the little bit of damage. The other thing that I think is a little bit interesting is that the creatures... What happens if it's like a gargantuan creature? What if you do this to a dragon that's on the ground for some reason? Do they just bury like one leg? A little strange. But we're not here to ask those questions. We're just here to make fun of the silly things that might happen when you cast the spell. But in all seriousness, that might need a clause of saying, only larger, smaller creatures fall in this. Something like that. Moving on, we're going to look at Orbital Stones, a Druid Sorcerer Wizard spell, casting time and action, range of self, concentration up to a minute. You lift 3 to small to medium rocks or similar objects from within 10 feet of you, cause them to defy gravity and slowly circle you. With all 3 stones, you have 3/4 cover. With at least 1 stone, you have half cover. That's a pretty good AC buff. As a bonus action, while at least 1 stone remains in orbit, you can magically fling a stone at a target within 60 feet. Make a ranged spell attack. On a hit, the target takes 3d10 bludgeoning damage and is knocked backwards 5 feet. Let's compare this to Melf's Minute Meteors for a second. Melf's is a 3rd level spell, this one is a 4th level spell. Melf's can last up to 10 minutes, whereas this one only lasts 1. But they both can be, shot as a bonus action, so that's why we're, kind of comparing them. So Melf's gets 6 meteors, this one only gets 3. Melf's only does 2d6, but it's AoE, and this one's single target. Yeah, I'd say this one's probably fine. I think the AC buff is super cool. I know a lot of tables that I've seen in action kind of forget about cover sometimes because it's easy to forget in the heat of things. So I think making sure everybody's kind of keeping up with the rules of how 3/4 and half cover work, I think is probably a cool thing. I think the damage is pretty well fine. The thought of having 3d10 bludgeoning damage on a bonus action attack is pretty spooky, but 3d10 at 4th, by the time you get 4th level spells is, I don't think, too bad, especially because it's taken up your concentration. So if you don't have something better to concentrate on at 4th, by the time you have 4th level spells, then you can have this. The last Earth one we're going to be looking at is Stone Fist. It's for Druid, Occultist, Sorcerer, Warlock, or Wizard. Finally, we get a Warlock spell on here. I think Warlocks can always use a few more cool spells. The casting time is an action, the range is self, and the duration is 1 round. You turn your hand and forearm, or similar appendage, to stone until the start of your next turn. As part of casting the spell, you may make a melee spell attack against 1 creature you can reach. On a hit, the creature takes 2d10 bludgeoning damage. Until the start of your next turn, you can use your reaction when you take slashing or piercing damage from an attack to gain resistance to the damage of that attack. This one isn't bad. 2d10 bludgeoning damage is fine for a 1st level spell. Comes out to an average of about 11 damage. 3d6, which is what Burning Hands would be, comes out to about 11.5. So that's what makes me think the spell honestly might just even be just a tad bit weak. 2d10 bludgeoning damage, I do love that this spell has the green flame blade wording of, you know, making a melee attack as part of casting the spell. I think that's super cool. I wish we had more of those. I could see kind of a different version of this spell being like, use a bonus action to attack, or like a bonus action to cast, and then you can use your action to attack. But then it wouldn't do, you know, just, it wouldn't be a melee spell attack probably, it'd be like just a regular melee weapon attack. But that would be a whole different kind of spell, I guess, at this point, now that I think about it. So, yeah, and then the ability to use your reaction when you take slashing or piercing damage from an attack to gain resistance to it. That's cool. I understand why they didn't do bludgeoning as well, because you break rocks, I guess, with a hammer. I guess is probably the flavor he's going for. Definitely would have to feel kind of bad if you're fighting somebody that only does bludgeoning damage, I guess. But, limitations of a spell. It's good to have. But yeah, super cool spell. I'd give it a pass. But with that, guys, I think we're going to call that the end of the video for today. Come back for part 2 where we're going to go over Force, Lightning, Thunder, and Poison spells. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.